I really appreciate the invitation, and I do hope the lights are on for all of us. Oh, look at that! Why did he say it? Why did he say it?
Dr. Bruce Caldwell is a research professor of economics at Duke University and director of the Center for the History of Political Economy. The center's purpose is to promote research in and the teaching of the history of economic thought. Professor Caldwell's research focuses on the history of economic thought with a specific interest in the life and the works of the Nobel laureate economist F.A. Hayek. He is the author of Hayek's Challenge, an intellectual biography of F.A. Hayek, and since 2002 has served as the general editor of the collected works of the book series called The Collected Works of F.A. Hayek. In November, his book, Hayek, A Life, 1899 through 1950, co-authored by
Hans-Jörg Klausinger and Bruce Caldwell,
appeared. It is the first of a 2-volume work, biography of Hayek, and the subject of this evening's talk. Professor Caldwell has served as the president of the Southern Economic Association and the History of Economics Society, and has held research fellowships at New York University, Cambridge University, and the London School of Economics. When I asked him, as is our tradition, to name his favorite economist, his 3 answers were F.A. Hayek, Friedrich Hayek, and Fritz Hayek. Please welcome Dr. Caldwell.
Honesty is the best policy, so that explains my question. Well, I'm delighted to be here. I was at Hillsdale once before. I didn't look up exactly when it was, but it must have been over a decade ago, maybe 15 years ago. But I did remember the walkways with the bricks and the names, and certainly the very impressive main building. The lighting was better then, and I just want to really express my appreciation given the unusual circumstances that there's so many people who came out this evening. So I really do appreciate that. Now, Alec told me that he would like me to mostly talk about Hayek's life as opposed to his ideas. I'm very used to talking about Hayek in either of those dimensions, but particularly given that this is to, in some sense, celebrate the publication of Hayek, A Life. I thought I would start out with that, but we can go in any direction that you want once we get to the Q&A. So I think probably the best place to start is why. Why do a book, a very fat, thick, heavy book on Hayek, given that there's been so much written about him over the years? As was noted, I have a book on some of his intellectual contributions, but there's many other people who have written about Hayek, and some of them about his life, often based on interviews that he gave at various points. So I thought the best way to answer that is to tell you how I came to write it, okay? And what actually was the process by which I decided to start this project. And it was a 10-year project. I started it in 2012, and it was published in November 2022. So it was a long-term commitment. So as was noted, I became the general editor of a book series called The Hayek Collected Works in 2002. This was a book series that had started back in 1988 when Bill Bartley was the first general editor of this collection of Hayek's writings. And the very first book in it was The Fatal Conceit. And if you have the copy of that book, it's kind of a slim book. It was Hayek's last book, but edited by W. Bartley III. And so he was the first general editor. He was in his 50s when he started this, and then in 1991, I think, he developed cancer and he died, a very young man. And the second general editor was a man named Stephen Kresge. He came out with some of the volumes, but he approached me after he knew I was working on Hayek's Challenge, the book that my first book on Hayek. and said, look, I have run out of money that the various foundations have given me to do this project. I think if we get a different person to edit the collected works, be the general editor, you'll have a better success at raising some money to do it, with being new blood and also someone who has a reputation for having worked on Hayek. So I said, sure. He said, but the family's got to agree. So you'll need to go and meet with, well, Hayek was dead in 2002, but he had two children, a son named Larry and a daughter named Christine. Hayek moved to England in the 30s, and his children grew up there, so they were, just British people. And so I went to England, went to London, attended my first Mont Pelerin Society meeting. John Blundell helped provide the stipend because they're very expensive meetings. If any of you have ever attended them, they're extremely expensive to go to, and I was just a mild-mannered academic, but not a lot of money, and was very happy to go there, and then took a train down to Devon in the western part of the country, and met Larry and Christine, and I was transfixed. So you pull into the train station. This she's about 20 plus years older than I am. Comes out. She's just. This is a person that I end up finding out had gone on sailing trips across vast areas in her 70s and 80s. Okay, I mean, this is just a wonderful, very impressive woman. And she says, "Okay, let's talk about my father." And I said, "Well, tell me about him." And she goes, I barely knew the man, she goes, and she just laughs and laughs and laughs. She's just this wonderful person. She's just full of stories. She said he was very interested in his own work, and she was just a little kid, so she didn't pay much attention to him, and he didn't pay much attention to her, et cetera, et cetera. But then she started filling in with lots of stories. And this went on for about 45 minutes. I realized, I should have been writing all this stuff down, but I wasn't, So I just felt like an idiot. But then she left, and it was Larry Hayek's house whose kitchen I was sitting in. Go through the same thing with him. And then meet Larry's wife, and they served me dinner. I stayed over in their house. The next morning, I get up, and Larry takes me up to his study. And this is absolutely filled with stuff from Hayek's life. Stuff that I didn't know, of course, existed. Amazing stuff. Turns out Hayek was a world-class, he was a member of the British Alpine Club, so he was somebody who did a lot of very intense climbing. But he was very athletic. He was a skier, and he had his skis up there, up in the rafters. Old-timey skis that you would, if you're a modern skier, you would not recognize these things as proper skis. But he was skiing well into his 70s, they told me. There were maps, and I thought, well, maybe because he's an alpinist, these are maps of regions where he was doing climbing. Turns out these were his maps from World War I when he was an artillery officer on the Italian front. I didn't find that out until much later, but that was what I was looking at. Playbills, hundreds of playbills from not only Vienna, but London, Chicago, all these other places that he lived. An album of photographs of orchids that he took when he was 16 years old for his father. His father was a medical, he was a doctor, but his passion was plant geography. So they would go to specific regions, identify plants that were unique to that region, and he was accompanying his father as the photographer of these new species. So it just was clear, and there was handwritten versions of The Road to Serfdom just sitting out, like early drafts. I'm just thinking, my goodness, this is wonderful stuff that nobody else knows about, and that if someone's going to do a biography, somebody needs to know the family and kind of get to know them better. So it was on that day that they were vetting me that I just suddenly said, boy, I'd really like to do a biography. There's a whole bunch of stuff that, I was pretty much of an expert on Hayek, and all of this stuff was new to me. So this really got my attention that there was material here for a much fuller story about who Hayek was as a person, where he came from, what his family life was like, and the rest. Now, one of the conditions that Hayek always thought that somebody was going to do his biography, and the general idea was that the general editor of the collected works, since that person would get to know the family and also know Hayek's work extensively, because the series is meant to reproduce his writings, would be the person to do the biography. But what I didn't realize was how much additional material in terms of things like correspondence that the family had. And this was something once I said to him, well, would you consider me as doing the biography? They showed me this stuff. And there was letters between his parents and him in World War I, when he took a trip to New York, all these different sorts of additional things that I didn't know existed. Bill Bartley, who was going to do a biography, also had a timeline, and he had a series of interviews that he had done with Hayek in the 80s that no one else had seen. So one reason I wanted to do this was there was just a whole bunch of new material that I, as somebody who knew Hayek well, realized was out there. And because I got to know the family, they were willing to share this with me, and wonderful, wonderful folks. One of the conditions of doing the biography was that the person be fluent in German. I, of course, studied French in high school and college, so this was not me. So this was going to be a real problem. But one of the people, when I was general editor of the collected works, who did a couple of the volumes, Hans-Jörg Klausinger, was by far one of the best volume editors that had. I worked with a lot of different people on the collected works, and some people didn't do all the things that they said they were going to do. They just weren't very, very good at keeping to a timeline or their promises. Hans-Jörg was perfect and did a great job. And we ended up working together very well. So that's how we came to do this book. It took a long time. There's a tremendous amount of material. There's archival material at the Hoover Institution at Stanford. That currently goes to about 200 boxes of material. We worked through a lot of that. I did interviews with Christine and other family members and people that knew Hayek. So I think we are able to tell a story that goes beyond most of the biographies that are out there. And one of the things that we really try to do is to try to place Hayek in particular moments in time and places, and try to give the reader a sense of what it was like to be in seeing the world through Hayek's eyes in these various moments in time and places. And another reason why he is a fascinating figure is we say early on it's a 20th century life, but he manages to be in some very intense places during a very intense century. So he's born in 1899 in fin de siècle, Vienna. This is a period of great intellectual creativity, but also ferment. Lots of different schools, artistic schools, academic schools. Freud is working there. You've got Gustav Klimt, whose artwork is superb. You've got innovations in architecture, much of the architecture not to my taste, but some very interesting developments on those fronts. Zionism, Theodor Herzl is active at that time. So it's a time of great ferment and creativity. Austrian School of Economics, for goodness sakes, is developing there, and logical positivism, one of its great nemesises. Nemesi? I'm not sure how to put that one. But anyways, so anyone who knows about Vienna at that time knows that's an interesting place. But we wanted to figure out what it was like in his world as a small child. So. My co-author was wonderful. I mean, a real Sherlock Holmes. He actually was able to dig out Hayek's school records and find out what his grades were. And he kept having to switch schools because his father, as a medical doctor, was actually working for the government. So he's a medical health officer, and you have to live in the district for which you're responsible. And he kept getting promoted, so he had to keep switching districts. So he was switching schools, and he hated school. Okay, he was very independent. His family he's got two younger brothers. Everyone always says, it was Hayek and then the two boys. He always hung out with the adults. He was one of these precocious children, bored senseless in school because school was rote and didactic, and the instruction was not good. So he got a lot of his knowledge with his family. His father was very proactive in terms of taking, whenever the family would go on either the weekend, they would go on various excursions. It would always be instructional. So they'd collect rocks one time, they'd collect flowers another time, they'd do something else, all oriented towards nature. Indeed, his entire birth family, a natural scientist, basically. The fact that he ends up being a social scientist was quite unusual because both of his children, one ended up being a medical doctor, the other one was a specialist in beetles. Okay, so he's a naturalist. And both of his brothers also natural scientists. So he grows up in a very kind of restricted environment because it's von Hayek, okay? So they are of kind of lower nobility. They're not rich, though. His mother's side of the family is pretty wealthy. Father's side of the family, not so much. And his father only worked in order to keep a job, but his passion was this plant geography. He had his own herbarium. So they as Hayek put it, we lived above our means, basically, through most of the period that he was as a child. He was very independent, as you could tell from his reaction to his schools. And indeed, what he would end up doing is not doing his homework, not studying, and then try to take a special exam at the end of classes that would allow him to pass. And one time he actually had to repeat a grade. And this drove his father nuts. His father was very unhappy about this, just saying, what's wrong with this kid? Why don't you do? But he also recognized that the child was very, very smart and that he was simply bored. So it was one of those sorts of situations. Hayek the World War I starts in 1914, so he's too young to fight until he's about 18. He might have actually even been a little younger than that when he got inducted. And he ends up going to the Italian front. So when I think of World War I think of All Quiet on the Western Front, So this is what people in America know about. This is where we ended up participating. Well, there was this Italian front, the Austro-Hungarian Empire against the Italians. Over 1 million people died on that front. It was, again, trench warfare that was absolutely brutal. And he ended up arriving at the front, and this gives you a sense of the type of battles. It was the 12th battle of the Isonzo, okay, that he arrives at. He just missed it. So this line is never moving. This is why it gives you an indication of how things were. And one of the things that comes, so he's writing to his parents during this wartime period. He's actually quite a great correspondent. He's clever. He's offering observations of the countryside and of camp life. So you really get a sense of him being a pretty entertaining writer. Now, it may have been under this special circumstance of trying to correspond with parents who are worrying about you. So it's a little hard to know exactly what's going on with that necessarily. One reason we have to say that is this and his trip, he has a trip to New York in the early 20s, is the only really extensive correspondence we have from Hayek with his family. And I'll explain why that's true as we go along. But so we don't have a lot in his voice in terms of correspondence, but this is one area where we do. And what we get from his correspondence is basically he's mostly bored. He ends up arriving just as the Austrians had moved the front to the river Piave. I don't know if that's the proper pronunciation, but it's a very wide, shallow river, and the Austrians were very happy to take a bunch of territory because it meant that they could feed their troops, and that was what they were doing. But they didn't want to push any further because they thought it would be difficult. The Italians had been reinforced by British and some Americans, volunteers, and they wanted just to hold the line too. They didn't want them, but they weren't going to be aggressive. So the two sides were just sitting there and looking at each other basically over a very kind of wide expanse, so not really taking pot shots or anything. He said afterwards, he works at the London School of Economics, and he found out later that some of the people that he would see through his glasses were people that he later would work with in London. But anyway, it was kind of just a static front. So he was bored, and his father would be very instructional. You should learn some languages, learn some Italian. Always being the instructional dad, and he would do actually fairly dangerous and crazy things, and probably just because he was bored. So one of the things he does is they had the bright idea that if you go up in a balloon, you'll be able to see what's going on with the enemy lines. So this ends up being a terrible idea. Okay, a terrible idea. They don't really get to see anything, and you had to practice being able to jump out of the balloon in case it gets shot down. And he said, one time he was practicing jumping out of the balloon, and he got the phone lines tangled up, and he nearly hanged himself. And the second time, the parachute he falls into a marsh and almost drowns. So. And he said, besides, you couldn't see anything. You go up there and you couldn't see anything. So it was just a total. But he's the guy who volunteers to go up in the balloon. He also was volunteering to ride along with people who were in these in planes. And he took 3 plane rides, 2 of which crashed. Yeah, it's just amazing that he survived the war. I mean, it was just. Great stories. He did see a little combat. There was one area where he did, and he shared a bit of that. But basically, the most dangerous parts of apparently the period that he was at the front was when he was trying to when they were retreating. The final retreat was very unorganized and dangerous. But mostly because people who were trying to get out of there were they're forcing their way into trains and doing various things that were life-threatening. The one thing that happened to him there, Hayek describes himself as a bit of a loner, and my sense of the man is that this is somebody who lived a cerebral life. He lived a life of the mind. He was always inside of his own head, observing things, and he was very on a very even keel, just very analytical about everything, even unfortunately sometimes about his personal relationships. And he described himself as a loner. He said, really, I only had 3 close friends, and one of them died in World War I, and this was something that haunted him for a long time, because in his eagerness to get to the front, he passed the town where his friend from secondary school was in hospital suffering from dysentery, but he wanted to get to his appointed position, and then gets a letter from his mother. Well, Walter Marg died, and he was just devastated that he didn't stop and see his friend. And his secretary, this is in the 1970s. Said at one point he was going through some things and came across Walter's picture and just had to turn away and hide his tears. And she said, Walter's death and his failure to have been there is something that I think he carried to his grave as one of his regrets. The other 2 friends were a guy that I'll introduce in a moment named Walter Firth. And then the third one was Lionel Robbins at the London School of Economics. So Hayek has a youth in Vienna, kind of very, not cloistered, but he only he attended schools for a couple of years, so he didn't have close friends there. Most of the people he knew were from his extended family. One of the only girls that he knew, because of boys' schools that he's going to, were a couple of cousins, distant cousins, third cousins, who he used to take dancing lessons with, kind of social dancing lessons with, from age 10. Okay, and that was really about his only contact with women outside of his mother. So this is a guy who's helpless in terms of understanding anything about relationships that don't have to do with either books or boys. Okay, that's going to be significant. Okay, because one of the dancing partners ends up being his second wife. Okay, but he comes back from the war, goes to the University of Vienna, is studying, is also seeing his cousin. They see each other regularly, as it turns out. But after he finishes university, he has the opportunity to go to America for 15 months. And he does it. And he doesn't say anything to her. And she assumes that, well, he doesn't care. So she marries somebody. She marries this other guy who's a very, very nice guy. Very good guy. And Hayek comes back from America, and they sit down and they have a conversation. She's now not only married but has a child. And they realize that, they loved each other. She thought he was going to ask her to marry her. He thought that she was going to marry him. But he just never said anything, because this guy's always in his head, and he doesn't know anything about the other sex, okay? I mean, he's just clueless. So, what are you going to do? So he marries somebody who looks just like her. That's Hayek's solution, okay? That's his solution. Yikes. Now, he likes this person, obviously. He's married her, but it has to be said, she looks just like her. I'm not a PowerPoint guy, but if I had pictures, I could show you this. And then they go on. Let me tell you about his trip to America, though. So up until this point, he's very much of a European. And I should back up before we get to America. Just say a little something about university. So the Austro-Hungarian Empire ends up being dissolved after World War I's over, okay? Don't really get the resolution until 1919, but basically this huge empire, now what you've got is Austria. That's it, okay? And these other countries are all countries, not part of the empire. And mass politics started to emerge in the 1880s, as it did in so many places, 1890s. And there is an ugly, ugly side to the mass politics. And particularly, one of the chapters is the varieties of anti-Semitism that started to emerge in Central Europe during this time. Not just in Central Europe. I mean, you can find this actually in the United States and other countries as well. But there was a religious anti-Semitism, often by people who were rural, less educated. The Jews killed Christ. The parish priest tells us this. This is the way we feel. There was economic anti-Semitism. There were people emigrating from the East who were peddlers. They were not like the assimilated Jews that lived in Vienna who entered kind of the German society, German culture, some of them indeed changing religions in order to be able to find jobs, but becoming really part of the social fabric of Vienna. These Eastern Jews were coming in. They retained the traditional headdress. They were Orthodox. They didn't want to speak German. They wanted to speak Yiddish or whichever place they came from, whatever the languages that they would be using, but basically Yiddish. And they were peddlers, and they were people who were selling goods that were competing with people who were small businessmen in the shopkeepers in Vienna. So there's economic aspects, and then this was a period of racial, scientific racial distinctions that were being made. Well, this is a wholly different race, and that's why they are the way they are. So this is kind of, all these things are going on at the same time that parties are starting to emerge in Austria that are looking for constituencies. And the three mass parties, one of them was kind of a pro-German party, and there were a variety of these. Some wanted actually to be united with other German-speaking countries. Others just wanted to support German culture. But many of them were anti-Semitic, and they had Aryan clauses. In order to join this party, you had to be an Aryan. Okay, you had to be committed to this German culture, and by birth that way. There was a socialist party that was, the Austro-Marxism was a fairly extreme form of socialism. And finally, there was a parties that they were Christian socials was the phrase that was used. So it was kind of Catholic, but there was a guy who became a kind of a popular politician named Luger, who just basically, he didn't hate Jews, but he realized that so many people did that he made this part of the rhetoric of his programs. And he was one of the people that was really pushing kind of the economic anti-Semitism, that this is a group that's competing with the good shopkeepers of Vienna and of Austria. So these are the mass parties. So Hayek comes back from World War I and enters university. He's studying law and immediately befriends this Herbert Firth, who is he's a Lutheran, but he's basically of Jewish heritage. So he's one of the people whose family had converted in order to find employment or expand employment opportunities. And they become close friends, and they join a small party that had just formed at the time that rejected the three basic elements of that they found obnoxious about the mass parties. So they were for German culture, but not anti-Semitic. Okay, so yes, German culture has something that's quite important for us, but we're not going to be anti non-Germans. They were kind of liberal reformers, but not socialists. Okay, so they're not Austro-Marxists, but Hayek sometimes says, I was a socialist when I was in college at university. He wasn't a socialist, but it was kind of like liberal reforms, kind of like soft, like Fabian might be a way to describe it. He turned away from that once he got to know Mises. Okay, so it didn't last too long, but that was where he was. And it was also, anti-empire and monarchy and all the rest. It was democratic. This is a really important point. Early on, he was committed to universal suffrage, male-female suffrage, he had. We show in the book, reference in the book, some of the stuff that we didn't put in the book that we put online about the relationship that he had to certain kind of Austrian feminist movements and things like that his family members did. That he was actually very much of a liberal at this period in time. The reason that's so important is because Hayek at times says, well, mass democracy is dangerous. Constitutional democracy, representative democracy is really important and good, but mass democracy can be used, can lead to very bad outcomes. That anyone who opposes liberalism, classical liberalism, says, you see, they hate the masses, they hate democracy, and there's all sorts of irresponsible accusations that are made against Mises and Hayek and others by critics of neoliberalism. So one of the things that we emphasize in the book is that early on he had these commitments to democracy as a form of government. Anyway, he goes to New York and he absolutely hates it. Okay, his reaction in New York is hilarious. He's writing letters to his family, but also there was one letter that he wrote to some of his friends at an agency where he was working that we find out later he never actually mailed because even he thought it was too over the top. But he just talks about, he goes to New York City, 1923, okay? This is the middle of the roaring 20s. New York is building its subway system. It's building all of its skyscrapers. Dorothy Parker, who's part of the Algonquin round table, said you could hear the noise. No, you could see the noise. That was her phrase. You know, it was just like cacophony. So this is what he's entering into. Everybody wants to talk about money. This is the standard European vision of America. And he actually says this in there. He says, of course, I came thinking, I had heard all these rumors about Americans being venal and have no taste and all they can think about is money. And he says, it's true. It's true. They're terrible. He talks about painted women. Painted women. So this is a guy who his understanding of women is zero. But he goes out on the streets and this is the first time that women, you know, people used to use makeup and mascara if you're in the theater. And if you're in the theater, you're already a little bit disreputable. Now here people are actually wearing this stuff out on the streets. And he says, painted women, they're everywhere. And he says, and the worst thing is, you can't tell what class people are. You can't tell what class people are. You know, how are you going to know? So it's just over the top, and it's really hilarious. But you really get a sense of someone who had grown up in a very traditional, not only a family, but the area of Vienna that he lived in. One of the things that, of course, we're doing is looking at these places, and you know he switched homes 4 or 5 times, but he really lived within a little less than 1 square mile, and he could walk across Vienna. You didn't need to have any kind of transportation. You didn't even need public transportation. He gets to New York City, and on his arrival, the person he's supposed to meet has gone to Florida. So he's, oh, gee, what am I going to do? And he gets on a bus down from Greenwich Village and goes up to Columbia. That's a trip of like 7 miles. I think it's 7. It might be 5. But still, it's a long trip. He suddenly gets a recognition that this is just a major city. One of the funniest things, too, that he reacted to was radio. So this is something that had just really appeared and became widely licensed. And of course, you know, his vision would be, what a wonderful innovation. You can listen to opera. You can hear, you know, great speeches by statesmen. This is a wonder. This is like the internet, okay? The internet is going to really, and it ends up being like the internet is, you know? He says, all they play is these stupid songs. Every place you go, yes, we have no bananas. That's the song. He writes it out. He says, yes, we have no bananas. I don't know if you know this song. It's an old song. But it's a horrible song. And I can just imagine Fritz Hayek walking around listening to this everywhere he goes. So anyway, he has this strong reaction, but he also spends a lot of time in the library. So he's doing courses, meets Wesley Clare Mitchell, the leading institutionalist of his day, starts to realize that some of the ideas that, you know, the Austrians are very critical of the German historical school, and we can get into the debates that they might have about that, but his reaction to Wesley Clare Mitchell is, boy, yeah, the German historical school is discredited after World War I. I go to America, and here's the guy who's kind of the avant-garde guy who's just becoming the president of the American Economic Association, expressing the same sorts of views that I thought had been discredited. So he's starting to recognize that there's views that are, yeah, the German historical school were conservative imperialists. Wesley Clare Mitchell is a progressive, yet they both have this vision of what science can do to fix society. You know, that we can fix society if we use science and we use smart people. And so the German historical school is building up this huge apparatus through their universities. The American institutionalists, it's people at Columbia University, is a major university. They have the same vision of how to put experts in place who are going to make society a better place. So he's starting to actually get this sense of maybe this thing. And he'll go to England in 1930 and encounter the Fabian Socialists, who is, again, a different group, but with the same vision of what can be done in terms of experts fixing society. So anyway, we've got him to his early 20s. He marries his first, what will be his first wife, and works very hard. A real networker. This guy writes a paper, and he has a list of kind of like an address book. And you go through this address book, and he has all of these foreign economists' addresses and numbers next to him. And then you go to the back of the book, and you see the numbers associated with various papers that he's written. And these are the people that he's sending these things to. So he's actually really trying hard to become an academic. He gets invited to the London School of Economics to give some lectures in the early 1930s. And on the basis of those lectures, he gets offered a position as an visiting assistant professor, and then ultimately gets a named chair there. So he's successful, very successful early on in moving to the London School of Economics. This is a wonderful place, and this is where Lionel Robbins, his third best friend, is. So Herbert Firth is his friend from the university days, and they're friends. I mean, Firth actually outlives Hayek. Hayek lives for 92 years. And then Lionel Robbins is his third closest friend. So those are the three that were closest to him. And you actually can see immediately how quickly he became friends with Robbins just by looking at their correspondence again. Most of Hayek's correspondence is very kind of formal. On that first visit where he gives 4 lectures and then goes back home, Hayek's letters to him are just flowing with friendliness in a way that you don't see in others. I want to talk a little bit. How long should I talk?
About 5 minutes.
5 minutes more? Okay.
I'll take another hour or two if you want. Here.
Let me talk about his time as a university professor at the London School of Economics. So who is Hayek in the classroom? It turns out, universally, people said that he was quiet, polite. I have a wonderful line from John Kenneth Galbraith, who was at LSE as a visitor and was at Cambridge as a visitor, would come to LSE for Hayek's workshop seminar, and said Hayek was a gentle man of comprehensively archaic views, who only rarely was able to speak. And I think this is exactly right. He was just very polite. He would try to get people to discuss. He had strong views, but he didn't push them. And you see this in remarks by people who were friends of his, like Robbins and Ronald Coase, but also opponents ideologically. The same sort of description occurs also of descriptions of his workshop at the University of Chicago. So I should just say, he moves from Vienna to London, is in London until 1939 when the LSE evacuates to Cambridge because of the start of World War II. It's in Cambridge that he writes The Road to Serfdom as part of the Abuse of Reason project. The Road to Serfdom becomes a very kind of best-selling sort of book, 15 Minutes of Fame sort of book. He goes on a publicity tour for this book in the United States, meets a funder who is willing to fund the first meeting of the Mont Pelerin Society in 1947. And so the Road to Serfdom and the institution building of the Mont Pelerin Society end up to be intimately linked. Very important development for the arguments for liberalism in a period when no one supported liberalism, really. I mean, we think liberalism's under attack now, when I say liberalism, I'm talking about classical liberalism. Obviously, I don't have to say that here, but just as it's under attack now, it was really under attack then, and that was something that he did. But he wanted to get a divorce, and his wife at first said that I'll give you a divorce. He gets a job offer from the University of Chicago because he needed to go to a place that would really pay him enough money to be able to support his family. He comes back, he says, I've got the offer, and she says, just kidding, I'm not going to give you the divorce. Forget about it. I saw a lawyer. The lawyer said, you can't divorce me, okay? You can't enforce a divorce here in England. So let's just not talk about it anymore. And so he ends up spending about a year and a half trying to figure out how to get the divorce and marry his childhood sweetheart, whose husband died conveniently, so that she didn't have to divorce him. I mean, it's a Catholic country that they were married in. But that's a very truncated description of how he ended up going to the University of Chicago in 1950. One of the wonderful things about Hayek is he's in England when John Maynard Keynes is writing the general theory. He knows him. They have arguments about this. He goes to the University of Chicago when the Chicago School of Economics is forming. He's always in the right place at the right time, and he's always arguing with people about things. So always a very engaging figure that way. But anyway, back to him at LSE just for a few more minutes. I loved him at LSE. He's working his butt off. He's actually teaching a lot. They have day school and night school. So he had to repeat the same class that he taught at 12 o'clock to day students to the night students who had jobs, because LSE is in the city, and a lot of people are part-time students who are taking classes then. Then he has his seminars. And he hates administrative work, but Lionel Robbins takes on all the administrative work. He loves Robbins. This is another reason he loves Robbins, because Robbins doing all the horrible stuff, that administrative work that every academic hates. I don't know anyone who doesn't hate it. Some people are good at it, but nobody really. I don't know. I guess some people like it. Thank God some people like it, because I certainly didn't. And so he's there, but he's there also at he has his own seminar, but there's a seminar called the Grand Seminar that is run by Robbins, Hayek, and Arnold Plant. And anyone here who's an econ major, who has done intermediate micro theory, that's when all of those diagrams and the math for that were being developed then. And Hayek is there watching it. And he's also thinking, this equilibrium theory, I don't know. He's also getting his doubts about it, but he's seeing it being formed. And that is so important. I mean, I'm telling you about his life and some funny stories and tragic stories, but you're also seeing how he's developing his ideas and what he's reacting to as he's developing these ideas. This is when he writes the first article, which is much more difficult to get, Economics and Knowledge, published in 1937, that leads to the much more accessible and famous article, The Use of Knowledge in Society in 1945. That is one that you probably have looked at. I can tell you, I could keep going forever, because I love this stuff. And I can't believe I've got such a large group of people here who sometimes are nodding their head instead of nodding off. So this is wonderful to me. So I could go for another 2 hours, but I want to respect the time limit that my host is asking me. So
for 10 minutes of Q&A.
And I can talk longer. So, sir.
Can you talk a little bit about his relationship with Mises, how they met?
Sure. So he was a formal student of von Wieser, but we do have documents that show that he attended some of Mises's seminars before he left university to go to New York. But their relationship really was less in the university and more in this government bureau, temporary government bureau that was set up after World War I to settle war debts across different countries. And Mises was one of the chiefs of that bureau, and Hayek worked under him. They got to know each other there. And Mises was really instrumental in helping him. Not only Hayek's early interests were in monetary theory and the critique of socialism. Both of those were areas that Mises had worked on, obviously. And after Hayek came, so he helped him get the time off from that job, plus the invitation from Jeremiah Jenks in New York to visit New York for that period. And then when he returned to that bureau, but he also entered the Mises Kreis, the circle, where they had discussions throughout the 1920s. And it was during that period that he really got to know Mises much better. He was a member of that circle. And they corresponded after he moved to London, and Hayek often visited Vienna. His relationship was, I think, always one of a student, but perhaps a favored student. I mean, Hayek was somebody who got along with everybody. If you think about Karl Popper as being one of his close friends and Mises being one of his close friends, both of these are very strong personalities who take, in many people's estimates, diametrically opposed views to how science works. Hayek is on best terms with both of them. They're best buddies. Now, not as close friends as Lionel Robbins, but he's close with them. Mises would get angry at Machlup. He would break with Haberler. Never happened with Hayek. They always remained on good terms. And Hayek would always see him. So when he moved to Chicago, for example, he was in Chicago from 1950 to 62. He would go to the Austrian Alps every year. As soon as school was over, the next day he's on a plane or getting to New York to take a boat over. And so this is the cover of the book. This is to emphasize, this is where he felt most at home. It was always going back to the mountains. I mean, he was an outdoorsy kind of guy who liked that. But he would always stop and see Mises in New York every time. So that was one person that he was always close to. So they were close. Mises would visit Hayek's first wife when she was pregnant, having Larry, the son. He was born in Vienna. She felt more comfortable with doctors that spoke her own language when he was born. And Mises would come by. She had to stay in bed prior to the birth for about a couple of months. He'd bring her newspapers, books, candy. So he was a friend of the family. Sir.
Could you say something about Hayek's connection with Menger? And also, was he more influenced by Wieser or by Menger?
So it's complicated. He knew Wieser, and he thought Wieser was a very impressive teacher and person. And he also knew Bumbewerk. Bumbewerk died in 1916, so before he went to university. But he knew him because his grandfather was a climbing partner of Bumbewerk's. So the whole sense that I got of Viennese society is that everybody knew everybody in that circle, in that kind of group of intellectuals. It was a very small, closed society that way. And so Hayek said, I only ever saw Menger walking by in an academic ceremonial, like at a graduation where you see a person leading the group with the staff, that sort of thing. But Menger's book was put in his hands by Ottmar Spahn, who was kind of a nationalist, kind of a crazy man, who Hayek studied under for about a year until he realized he was crazy, and then they broke. But and Wieser became his main professor, and that's all in there. It's all in there. And Spahn, he says Spahn's greatest contribution was that he put Menger's book in my hands, and I read it and thought, boy, this is good stuff, as opposed to the stuff that Spahn is talking about. So it actually was I think that Menger had an influence in terms of the ideas that he read. And one of Hayek's students at Chicago that I've been recently talking to said that he just thought that Hayek was just pure mind. That when he was critical of socialism, he said he thought that Hayek's transition from being somebody who was kind of a liberal side of progressive side of liberalism to being a classical liberal was an act of mind. It was just analyzing the arguments and saying, yeah, these set of ideas are wrong, and this is what makes more sense. And I think that he was somebody who was not passionate in his dismissal of socialism. It was that this is just wrong. This is going to lead to bad outcomes. Well, I think he was right. I mean, but it's interesting to hear people talk about how he would make those arguments. Yep. So I think the idea that he got a lot out of Menger just by reading him makes perfect sense. Makes perfect sense. That's where I was going with that. Yes.
From your research of Hayek and his work, what, in your opinion, has allowed him and his philosophy to resonate not only with people from the early 20th century, but also to the modern era, where so many academics fall by the wayside?
Well, he's. Oh my goodness, that's interesting.
Power on. Someone try and plug the switch.
Gender studies sabotaging us again.
Power is
Is this full power now?
Yeah. You ready?
Is that what that means? Because I'm in a hotel. Oh, it's this building. Well, it might be all. So what? How would you answer that?
I mean, I would honestly, I'd argue that perhaps his work speaks to the individual, and like the individual being an entity who can govern himself and is not predictable.
Mises's work does too, though. And Hayek has much more cachet than Mises. I think not amongst certain Austrians, but and many Austrians say they're both fundamentally important. I absolutely agree with that. But there's something about the way that Hayek's writing, and it's not that he's a beautiful writer. It's not that. So what is it? What is it? It's a good question. That's a great question. Why does he resonate? Because people who hate classical liberalism still seem to respect Hayek, or at least think that they need to discredit him because he is not an. Yeah, Mises would sometimes be viewed as an easier target because you could find phrases that, taken out of context, could make him look quite dogmatic. Although some people would say, even who favor him, that he might have been dogmatic. Okay, so you have those views, but they take Hayek more seriously. I think one. I got attracted to studying Hayek not out of political reasons, although I ended up, as time went on, finding I just agreed more and more with those views. It was that he was thinking about how do you do economic science. So there's this methodology bit. There's this crazy book that is actually so insightful on psychology. So he's writing on political philosophy. He's writing on the methodology of economics, and it's just he's so rich. Yeah, I just constantly learning by studying this guy. So that was what it was for me. But you're asking a different question, which is why would others find him? And I don't know. I'd be interested in hearing what other people thought as well. I don't know. Yeah.
Before we do run out of time, thank you so much for coming. I've enjoyed pretty much every minute of this discussion.
Me too. But I like hearing myself talk. I'm just a standard academic on that regard. I'm afraid.
The question I had refers back a little bit to some reading some of us have been doing in our CPE course.
Okay.
We've been going through some selections from James Buchanan.
Okay.
In a few sections where he's somewhat critical of Hayek, particularly over the rational planning in
Yep.
terms of institutions and the spontaneous order and evolutionary approach.
Right.
I wondered what your thoughts were on that distinction, particularly later on in his life when he gets to law, legislation, and liberty.
Yeah.
Does that dichotomy that he uses break down a little bit when he's talking about designing and forming particular rules of institutions and governments? Or is there something improper that a reader is missing by taking that kind of approach?
So I try to deal a little bit with that question in Hayek's challenge, where I think you can read Hayek as operating sometimes on two different levels when it comes to some of his evolutionary thinking. On one level, he has a certain sets of ideas that he favors, but if he's being a scientist and is talking about how things might survive through time, he's operating on a kind of meta level. So I think you can actually divide between those levels as one way to rationalize it. But I think there is a tension in Hayek's work. What is a spontaneous order? Well, part of, I think, why he even used that phraseology is that there are ordo liberals in Germany. He moves to Freiburg in '62, to the home of ordo liberalism, and this social market philosophy says that we want to have free markets, but they have to be well ordered. Okay, ordo liberalism. And what does that mean? And he worries, I think, a little bit about how much imposition of order is going to be undertaken by the state. And now these are people like Rupke, and Eugen's dead, and by that time Rupke's almost dead. But the ideas are there. And I think think of the notion, why would he use the phrase spontaneous order? He's trying to push back against I think maybe that kind of much more constrained order. But so you can understand the development of his ideas and why he might use certain phrases. But you think about spontaneous order and what does it apply to? Which social institutions does it apply to? He's always talking on a very kind of high level, and it's hard to pin down. And that I think that Buchanan was present at the session in Obergurgel in 1982. It was a Liberty Fund conference. Victor Vanberg was also there. Vanberg is just, he's retired from Freiburg. His son, George, is a professor, by the way, at Duke in the political science department, so it's great to have him there. But there was a lot of pushback against Hayek's ideas that found their way into the fatal conceit, ultimately, that were along these lines. And I think you can have an I like Hayek's work better than I like Buchanan's work on that particular level, but I can understand Buchanan's complaints given his views as to constitutional orders.
Unfortunately, that's our time. A big hand for Dr. Caldwell.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate the invitation, and I do hope the lights are on for all of us. Oh, look at that! Why did he say it? Why did he say it? I'm sorry. I am so sorry.